Welcome to Difficult Dialogues, Voices from the Valley. I'm Lynn Pasquerella, president of Mount Holyoke College. Difficult Dialogues is intended to bring voices from the Valley to bear on some of society's most complex issues. This is a second part of a series on civil liberties, and I'm pleased to be joined by Professor Chris Pyle from Mount Holyoke College and Bill Newman, a distinguished lawyer, director of Western Massachusetts ACLU, and an author. Bill, you have a new book coming out, When the War Came Home. Tell us about some of the most compelling cases that you've outlined in this book.
Well, they talk about a number of cases, all of which come out of Western Massachusetts and which we've handled at the Western Massachusetts office of the ACLU. One is Bunny King's case, and Bunny King's case is important for a number of reasons. It was the first gay custody case to be litigated, the first gay custody case to go to a state's highest court, the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts. It was not a divorce case involving that kind of custody, but it was involving the return of children to mom. And mom was denied the return of her children because the judge found that having a lesbian household in which she proposed to raise the children inherently created an element of instability that was not in the best interest of the children, and so the guardian would keep the children and mom could visit 2 hours a week with supervision, according to the judge. And that case went to the Supreme Judicial Court, and the Supreme Judicial Court ruled that that was wrong and that her sexual orientation should not be a determinative factor. In fact, it's not relevant at all unless it somehow is impacting her parenting skills, which obviously it does not and did not. And so her children, after a second trial, were returned to her. That case was first tried in Franklin County in Greenfield in 1979. The Supreme Judicial Court's decision was 1980. We are now 3.5 decades later, and gay marriage is still or marriage equality, more fairly stated, is still a contentious issue around the country, and we still have a long way to go to achieve equality. Now, the Supreme Court may decide that the right way, which will in fact make marriage equality a reality, but it's not going to end discrimination against gays and lesbians and transgender people in the country. So this is a fight that goes on and on and on, and I talk about that both in terms of where we were in 1980 and where we are today. So that's one of the issues. Another case that I think is interesting, and I talk about this, I talk about the takeover of Goodell Hall by the students of the University of Massachusetts some years ago, and I talk about protest and how it is effective and where it's effective, and how every generation that does it has to relearn, to my old self, relearn those same lessons that we've all learned. But in fact, protest continues, and the same fights continue. The fights about mandatory minimums that seemed impossible to believe that we would have such a thing in America. That the judge wouldn't decide the sentence, that a legislature would say everyone goes to jail for 20 years, no matter how unfair. That seemed impossible, but here we are. That people could be detained without bail, that seemed impossible, but here we are with Guantanamo, where people not only are detained without bail, they are detained without charges for decades on end. So I talk about how, and I get back to how it's the same fights in many ways over and over and over again that need to be fought and need to be won.
Let's talk about the specific cases. The first case you mentioned about parental rights. The courts traditionally have regarded biological parents as being in the best interest of the child, and there were some egregious cases of toddlers being taken away from their adoptive parents because of fathers who hadn't claimed custody at the time that the children were given up for adoption. How do we reconcile this? Should we regard biological parents as always having a prima facie right to custody?
I think that the correct standard is that biological parents have it's presumptively in the best interest of the children to be with biological parents who are available, for sure. And sometimes when they're not available, for example, I don't think that a mom who goes to jail for 6 months loses her right to raise her children when she comes out, or a dad for that matter. But I do think there obviously are situations where it is not in the best interest of the children, and a parent is incapacitated for any number of reasons, or incapable of providing for a child. And that, I don't mean in a material sense, because if we meant in a material sense, the Queen of England would have all the world's children. So I do agree it's a very difficult situation, and it's very fact specific. And by and large, I don't like the idea of the state determining who's raising the children and making these determinations, except when the safety of the kids are in fact endangered. There are a lot of kids who, and I'm not saying this is that I would wish it on a child, but there are a lot of kids who overcome adversity in their own homes, and they turn out to be the stronger for it, and we as a society are better for them having done that.
Determining the safety of the child, of course, is the sticking point, and we know that some children are being taken away from parents who are smokers when the children have asthma, or parents have had their children taken away because they are regarded as too obese. Chris, how should we deal with these cases of supposed child abuse and neglect with behavior that is within the rights of individuals?
I don't have any easy answer to that. As Bill says, these are highly fact-specific. And some of these decisions should not be permanent decisions. There are sometimes ways in which you can remove a child from a bad situation until the situation resolves itself. There are ways in which you can involve other people, including grandparents and neighbors. This is not something that the law can handle with a decree that fits everybody. As you know, there's a lot of social work that has to go on in this. As the child of two chain smokers who did a lot of secondary smoking in his youth, I would have been very upset if some officious person had waltzed in and said, well, your mother smokes too much, you gotta come and live with strangers. No, of course not. But if my mother was doing drugs, that would be another matter.
Well, that matter has come up recently with fetal protection policies in states prosecuting women for giving birth to children who are either drug addicted or have traces of drugs, even if there isn't any measurable deleterious impact on the child. Bill, what should we think about these laws?
Well, I think they actually have a different agenda. And the agenda is to try to get courts to say that fetuses have rights. And if fetuses have rights, then we can use those precedents in those cases to say women can't get abortion unless a specific state legislature says it's okay. And it is, in fact, I think, part of an attack on reproductive rights, much more than it is a fight to protect a child who will be born. You know, it's the rights of the unborn, and once you establish that the unborn or fetuses have rights and are protected by the United States Constitution, then where does a woman have the right to terminate her pregnancy? So I think that you need to look at what I think is the real motivation for these laws, which is not about protecting the woman and not about protecting the child nearly so much as it is about making sure that the right wing can say all abortion will be outlawed because that's God's will, and God's will is what we're protecting, and America should promote God's will, and so women don't get to decide. We who have God's will and God on our side through our elected legislators get to decide. So I think that's what the fight is really about. On the more specific question of what about a woman who is endangering a child that she is going to to whom she will give birth, and that child's born addicted, I think that is fundamentally not a criminal issue. It should be dealt with as a family issue and as a best interest of the child question. Why do we think that the best way to deal with that is to let's threaten people and threaten women and threaten doctors with prison time?
You mentioned protest as well. Recently, we had a protest on the UMass campus, the Westboro Baptist Church, and so it was an anti-gay protest, and a number of, actually thousands of people came out from the local communities to support an athlete who has recently come out as gay, a basketball player. What are the limits of free speech with respect to hate speech, these kinds of protests with the Westboro Baptist Church protesting at funerals of slain soldiers, the children who are killed in massive shootings. Any limits, and the same holds with respect to abortion clinics. The courts have ruled on this, but should people be allowed to protest outside of abortion clinics?
Well, I have a couple questions. As you like to tell me on my radio show, that was a number of questions.
Yes.
But I do write about that in this book, and I talk about the invitation that the Young Republican Club and Students for America, which had strong cross-fertilization, had extended to Paul Cameron, who at the time was the leading gay basher in the United States, and they invited him to the University of Massachusetts to speak and to have a rally during one of the first gay pride weeks at the university. And people tried to stop them. And I couldn't believe that we just opened. We hadn't even opened officially the Western Massachusetts office of the ACLU. And Students for America and the Young Republican Club call and say, what about our First Amendment rights to bring him here? And that, as a matter of law, is right. They have that right as a recognized student organization to bring that speaker to the campus. Now, I almost threw up. I did. And I had to go wash my hands after having a long conversation. I don't know how that gets transmitted through the phone. I did all of that. And we came to the campus, and we had a strong support from, among other institutions on the UMass, the Women's Studies Department, who said, yeah, minority views need to be, the right to present minority views need to be protected on this campus. And in response to all that, there was the largest pro-gay rights demonstration ever, up to that time, that ever been held at the University of Massachusetts. There were plants at his speech that asked questions that made him look really, really homophobic and evil. There were all sorts of support services set up. There were editorials in all the local newspapers. It galvanized the gay rights movement here in the Valley. And that, I think, is the paradigm, that the answer to bad speech is good speech, to evil speech is righteous speech. And if we let that play out, instead of having the government say, no, we'll censor the speech, we end up much stronger, much better, and much freer.
So was Brandeis wrong to disinvite the anti-Muslim speaker that they were going to give an honorary degree to?
I think they were. There is a distinction between free speech and having someone come onto campus to say something that is evil, and giving somebody an honorary degree. When you give someone an honorary degree, you're holding them up as a respectable person to your students and to your alumni and anybody else who's watching. But from what I've been able to read in the newspapers, and I don't know whether I know the full story, I think that she was a person who ought to be respected, even though you might not agree 100% with what they say. I've heard graduation speakers at Mount Holyoke College say things I found were quite shocking, frankly. It didn't hurt to hear dissenting views or overstated views, because that's what this one's really about, is that we might dispute the scope of her condemnation of Islam or the way in which she did it. But if you understand it from her experience, it's not an unreasonable position to take. We all overstate things a bit, but she was and is a quite honorable person, well worthy of an honorary degree.
One of the chapters I liked most in your book was the chapter on the Rosenbergs. Talk about that.
Well, Robbie Mirapol, who is the younger son of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, is a close friend, and I've served on the board of directors of he is the founder of the Rosenberg Fund for Children, which provides for the educational, emotional, and other needs of children of activists who have been targeted because of their political activism. The Rosenberg case is, I think, significant, and I follow that through in some of the threads of what happened there to what's happening today in the so-called war against terror, is that the trial was a fix. In the hysteria, anti-communist hysteria of the 1950s, here were communists. That makes them presumptively guilty, and they are accused by the United States government of giving the secret of the atomic bomb to the Russians. Well, they never gave the secret of the atomic bomb to the Russians because what eventually was revealed were these drawings that could have been made by a third grader and in any event were available in any public library at that time, and they didn't give it to them at all. The government invented the evidence, and they didn't charge them at the end of the day with actually giving the secret of the atomic bomb to the Soviet Union. They charged them with a conspiracy because they couldn't actually prove, they had no proof that they actually did any of this, but they had wanted to do this. They had agreed to do this. And they didn't. It was not the secret of the atomic bomb. It was involved in some various kinds of espionage. Now, it didn't happen. And what I go into is some of the ways in which the government invented the evidence just before the trial, because they had no evidence against Robbie's mother. They invented the evidence to convict her because they were sure that if they convicted her, she and her husband would then talk to the government and give them what they wanted, which was not anything to do with the Soviet Union, but was names of their political colleagues and their comrades, because they were communists. And the government does exactly the same thing today, because conspiracy is the government's favorite charge. You don't have to prove that anybody did anything, just that they agreed that they wanted to do something. And I tell this story about how when we were defending this was not an ACLU case, but we were defending a group of individuals, and they were charged with seditious conspiracy in the federal district court in Springfield. The case had been moved from Boston, and the seditious conspiracy, a conspiracy to overthrow the United States government by force or violence. And I don't think this would happen today, but back then the support committee, the defense committee, printed T-shirts that said, "Join the conspiracy." Don't think that would happen today, because that in and of itself would be enough to get you indicted, and might get you indicted today. But everyone said, really, overthrow the government? Didn't we all want to do that once upon a time? I mean, so I think that the Rosenberg case is really apocryphal, and I find it deeply distressing how many of the same ways in which the government convicted and executed the Rosenbergs are still present and part of the playbook of the Department of Justice today.
Chris, what should we think about the use of the death penalty in the United States today?
Well, I happen to think there are some people who richly deserve to be put to death. But I wouldn't trust myself or the people who run the system to pick the right ones. And if I can't trust our society to pick them well, because I know that at least there are 130 who they wrongly sentenced and convicted, spent years on death row, then we have to have something short of that. And so that will be life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. But even there, I have some concern about not revisiting some cases, because I think life in prison can be a living death, and in some ways worse than simply dispatching oneself. And we don't yet get to the point where we review the work of our criminal justice system, which is rigged. We have very few people who are ever tried. The textbook theory of prosecution and conviction, trial by jury and all that is an illusion, just as it's an illusion that the United States is a democracy. That too is an illusion. So I would want a full review of the entire criminal justice system, and particularly the Federal Department of Justice and many state attorneys general's office and U.S. attorneys' offices. Too much power, not enough sense of proportion. And people from some other countries could teach us a lot about that.
There are certainly some legal scholars who regard plea bargaining as a form of torture, because you end up making a plea to avoid the death penalty or a severe sentence.
It's certainly a coercion, and an inappropriate coercion, and nothing that will give you the truth. But we'll clear the docket, and we'll give some people some scalps, and they can go to higher office based upon their tough-on-crime position.
The ACLU has certainly taken an interest in the shortage of execution drugs and the potential of violating the Eighth Amendment rights of people who are scheduled to be executed. Bill, is there any recourse? In most of the cases, their appeals have been denied.
The amazing thing about the Innocence Project and all of the individuals who have walked off of death row after 10 or 20 or 30 years and even been found to be innocent is that all of those people were indicted, convicted, found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, sentenced to death, the death penalty being deserved beyond a reasonable doubt, had an appeal and had that conviction affirmed, no legal error there. In most cases, had a habeas corpus petition denied, some with motions for new trial denied, all of those panoply of due process rights. And you know what? The system failed, and it fails a lot. It fails a lot because people are badly represented. It fails because there is a racist element that just permeates the entire criminal justice system, and a variety of reasons that the system gets it wrong, and innocent people are sentenced to die, and it continues to happen. Pause for just a moment, because we're recording this show the day after the sadness of the New Hampshire legislature, the Senate voting, I think it was 14-14, so the repeal did not happen in the 19th or 20th state yesterday. But that said, there has been an explosion in the number of states that said, we don't want to be part of this kind of reprehensible so-called justice. And so the death penalty, I think, in the United States is dying. That said, the fact that states with the death penalty can't get their hands on the drugs that are needed to kill people in our name or in the name of the state, I think shows how much the opposition has grown. Drugs used to be supplied by European drug manufacturers. They won't supply drugs to be used to kill people in the United States anymore. These drugs are untested. These drugs clearly have caused, as witnesses have viewed, torture of people being put to death. And the prosecutors have gotten up and said, yes, but you're not entitled to a painless death. Painful death may be something the state has the absolute right to inflict. I mean, when you hear these arguments, it's enough to make you cry and weep for what has happened and what is represented as justice.
What about the Boston Marathon bombing case, the Tsarnaev case? Is he being treated fairly?
Well, it's difficult to comment on a case that is in progress. I think that a lot of people would say, you know, obviously he's guilty. There's a prime example of someone who deserves to die. But I think that the fact that the case is being rushed to trial, and it is, I think the fact that the person they'd really like to is already dead, because if he were alive, Tsarnaev wouldn't be being prosecuted for the death penalty now. They'd be offering him a deal to testify against his brother. It's just that the Justice Department says, well, someone should die, and the guy we want to kill is already dead, so we'll kill the other guy. I mean, this is justice. This is rationality. It makes no sense to me that in a state that has said time and time again that we do not want a death penalty, that the federal government can come in and say, oh, yes, you do.
And this has been a tension here in Massachusetts. Massachusetts is quite clear. We don't want the death penalty anymore. Excuse me. But the federal government has tried to cherry pick cases where they could have a death penalty in Massachusetts. And that's the tension between two systems of government that overlap. In the case of the younger brother, I'm concerned at the way he's being treated in prison, the degree of isolation to which he's been subjected is, to me, close to torture. I would not be surprised if we were to discover that this kid turns out to be barking mad. Would not surprise me at all, given the degree of isolation to which he's been subjected to. Justice, mercy, decency requires that when you have somebody in prison who has either been convicted or is simply awaiting trial, not be treated so inhumanely. Now, I'm not saying that he deserves anything. I'm talking about us. We should do better. We should be more civilized. And we should keep in the back of our minds that when you bureaucratize these treatments and you make them apply to everybody, you end up finding a lot of innocent or not so guilty people and treating them badly and destroying their mental stability. And that doesn't do any good for the other people in the prison who have to live with them day by day.
Chris, you have a new book coming out.
Well, I wouldn't say it's coming out.
You're in the process
coming
of writing
together.
Campaign
It is
finance.
a great bottomless pit into which I'm pouring words.
All right, and this is on campaign finance reform?
Yes, it is. I decided that it's the most serious civil liberties issue facing the country. And one of the things that decided me on doing the book was the vote last July to shut down part of NSA's spying. The vote was very close, 7 or 8 votes apart. But if you look at the pattern of who voted to keep the NSA spying, you find they're the people who received large campaign contributions from the 2,000 corporations that make money doing the spying for NSA. And when you create this government-private partnership in spying, you generate more spying because nobody is going to get a contract for reducing spying or reducing the data banks. No. These people make money by finding ways to do even more spying. So you create a kind of bureaucratic momentum to spy, 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 collect, collect, collect. And people make money on it. And that, to me, is a sickness.
Well, we're very much looking forward to reading your book when it comes out. And Bill, congratulations on yours, When the War Came Home, which will be out.
Well, I have a reading at Forbes Library May 14th.
Excellent. Congratulations. And thank you again so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.